I'm very, very moved to see you here at McAllister. And thank you to Macabre Books for inviting me, to Marley Rusoff, who's made all this possible, and to McAllister College. Now, this book, The Interpreter, is really about three people, but it's also an untold story about the greatest generation that liberated Europe from the Nazis at the end of World War II. The three main characters in The Interpreter aren't in any of our history books. One of them, James Hendrick, a black private in a truck driving unit, was convicted of murder and attempted rape and was executed by the Army. One, George Whittington, was a white elite combat officer, the spitting image of Papa Hemingway, who was accused and acquitted of murder and who went on to be celebrated and decorated. The third man was neither an American officer or a GI. He was a Frenchman, a novelist, who was also an official interpreter for the US Army at the courts-martial of the other two. His name was Louis Guillou. Guillou wasn't sure what to make of what he was seeing in the American military court, but it bothered him. He kept writing in his diaries, trying to make sense of a great democracy that had a racially segregated army. It wasn't until 1976, over 30 years after he had served as an army interpreter, that Guillou published a novel about his experience. I first came to this story through Guillou's novel. The book intrigued me because it had a strange title, OK Joe, which isn't at all the kind of title a French intellectual of his generation, the peer of Marot and Gide, would give a novel. I read it, and I found in it a completely different view of World War II from the one I had grown up with. Like most Americans, I was raised thinking of World War II as the last war where good was truly good and evil was truly evil, the war where you knew who the enemy was. When I began translating Guillou's novel, OK Joe, I set out on an intense intellectual journey. The first thing I did was to get as close as I could to the texture of Guillou's language. Translating for me is the most intimate way to get to know a book. Guillou had a wonderful sense of American voices, and it was fascinating for me to translate back into English the GI language he had captured so well in French. He wrote in a spare, sketchy style with no editorializing, leaving the reader to draw his or her own conclusions. But each detail he used about a place or a character was so vivid, so well placed, that one was left with a feeling of being right there at the liberation of France in the summer of 1944, with the planes overhead and the bombs going off in the background. As I worked, I realized that what made Guillou's novel so important wasn't only its literary qualities, it was his insight into a hidden history. Reading secondary sources such as the US Army's official history called The Employment of Negro Troops, I found much evidence of racial unrest and the tragic effects of segregation in the Army, but also large gaps. Guillou filled in some of those gaps. He told a story where white soldiers were acquitted and black soldiers condemned for murder. But Guillou was less interested in charging the Army with overt racism than he was in making precise scenes of racial segregation come alive for his reader. Like the historical James Hendrick, Guillou's character, based on Private James Hendrick, but never named in the novel, was guilty of killing a man. He'd fired his rifle through a wooden door and killed a French peasant on the other side. He then assaulted the man's widow. His trial did not make for a sentimental tale of innocence victimized. In the spirit of Guillou, who never shied away from a complicated situation, the ethical universe I'm exploring in The Interpreter is murky and complex. It recalls the complicated set of factors that legal activists must deal with today when, for example, they explore disproportionate death sentences for black versus white criminals, or disparities in punishment between white-collar crime and street crimes. The issue is not virtue versus evil. It is structural and systematic prejudice, far harder to prove in individual cases, but far more devastating to society at large. Despite the ambiguity of the ethical universe I portray, I wanted the narrative of the interpreter to unfold suspensefully, like a novel, not a treatise. And I wanted every detail of the book to be grounded in documents and facts. So on a narrative level, I like to think of the interpreter as a moral whodunit. When I started my research, I didn't know how much of what Guillou wrote was true and how much he was using fiction to tell a story of his own making. One thing seemed pretty likely. I thought he must have made up the case of a white officer acquitted after the brutal murder of a resistance fighter. Too dramatic to be true. I was determined to find out what was actually in the record. So that became the next phase of my journey. I spent 4 years as a sleuth, not only retracing Guillou's steps, but finding information from a huge array of sources: army records, court-martial transcripts, obscure French police reports, interviews with living descendants and with witnesses, French civilians who remembered the American liberators, and American veterans in Brittany after the Normandy invasion. I got help in my search from dozens of people in the US military, in archives, French and American, at the state, the national, and the municipal level. In the end, I was able to locate almost everyone who was still alive with a connection to the stories Guillou told. Although some preferred not to speak to me, others were extremely generous with their time. I thank over 140 people in my acknowledgments, and I'm not exaggerating. There was Rich Boylan at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, who guided me to a day-by-day diary of the 8th Corps Army Court-Martial, listing each of Guillou's trials. That kind of document is apparently almost unheard of. I found and interviewed Emmett Bailey, the Graves Registration Company sergeant who buried James Hendricks. And I traveled to a retirement community for Army officers and their families, where Eleanor McKechnie shared her late husband's box of photos and documents connected to the Whittington trial. Her husband had attended the trial and had always dreamed of writing a novel about it. Even graveyards turned out to be valuable sources of information. One of those graveyards, a place to the east of Paris, where the US Army buried 96 men it had executed in World War II, had never before been visited by a civilian. I found Emmett Till's father buried in that graveyard, as well as James Hendricks. My journey started in Normandy and Brittany, at the scenes of the crimes Guillou wrote about from his vantage point as a court interpreter. But my research on D-Day territory on the northern coast of France brought me back to the US. It was only after 18 months of intensive work that I located James Hendricks's family. To my astonishment, it turned out they lived only 40 minutes from my house in Durham, North Carolina. I see the journey from Normandy to Warren County, North Carolina, as being the best metaphor for this book. The story of two very obscure soldiers in World War II also brings us to an aspect of contemporary American life, the legacy of Jim Crow and racial segregation, that in some ways has changed enormously in 60 years, and in other ways hasn't changed much at all. In the end, Louis Guillou took me right home. I want to read a little for you right from the beginning of The Interpreter. Chapter 1 is called Plumeaudin. At dawn on November 24, 1944, the day after Thanksgiving, a 2.5-ton American Army truck made its way from the disciplinary center at Le Mans to Plumeaudin, Brittany. Its destination, an abandoned chateau down the road from the village church. The Army had chosen one of Prumodon's only imposing structures for the ceremony. Château La Vallée was a 14th century manor house, deserted for years, with rickety stone walls and gaping holes where windows had been, a round tower, a lower square building facing the road into the village, and a courtyard the size of a baseball field. There in the courtyard, a group of military police unloaded their kit: large pieces of wood, slats, steps, a crossbar for the rope. The sky over Prumodon was relentlessly gray that Friday morning, and it looked like it might never stop raining. There was a wet chill in the air, the kind that goes straight to your bones, a prelude to the coming winter, so bitter cold it would freeze the rivers. The villagers awoke to the sounds of hammering. The mayor had received his instructions 2 weeks earlier. The citizens of Prumodon were to be informed, but official attendance should be limited to authorities designated by the American Army. No photographs could be taken, the Americans had said, and the local press was to omit the name of the condemned man or his unit from any of its articles. 30 American soldiers had also received instructions from units stationed all over Brittany and Normandy, from Caen to Morlaix. They were ordered to leave their posts for 1 day of temporary duty in a village located 7 miles southwest of Dinan. They reported that Friday morning to the commanding officer, Seine Disciplinary Training Center. He arranged them in the courtyard, designating some as official witnesses, others as authorized spectators. It was only then that they learned what their duty was. In 1 hour, an American soldier was going to hang. His name was James E. Hendricks. He was a black GI from a quartermaster battalion that had camped in a field in Le Percou, a tiny farming hamlet up the hill from Prumodon, back in August, only days after the town was liberated by the Nazis, from the Nazis. The soldiers who'd been brought to observe knew little about the crime except that Hendricks had killed a local peasant. A court-martial had found him guilty and sentenced him to hang by the neck until dead. But they all knew the policy. GIs who committed crimes against French civilians were punished in the community where the crime occurred. At 10:59 a.m., a cargo truck with its white U.S. Army stencil and flapping canvas top arrived in the courtyard, delivering the condemned man. General prisoner James Hendricks was escorted by a procession of 2 guards and 4 officers to the platform on the gallows. Hendricks was 21 years old, with round cheeks, gentle eyes, and dark brown skin that stood out next to his guards' ruddy white faces. He wore his uniform, but his jacket had been stripped bare of the modest insignia that identified him as a private first class in the quartermaster battalion. He had killed Victor Bignon, a decorated World War I veteran and a respected farmer who sat on the Prumodon town council. Madame Bignon and her daughter had kept to themselves since the trial, and rumors abounded in the village about what happened to them the night of the crime. James Hendricks had been confined to the guardhouse in Saint-Vouguet in the western part of Brittany since his sentencing. His closest contact there was with Lieutenant Robert Saunders, one of the Army's few black Baptist chaplains. The task of preparing James Hendricks to die was one of the most difficult of Saunders's Army career. Back in 1943, he'd been attached to the same quartermaster battalion as Hendricks at Camp Van Doren, Mississippi, a training camp for black GIs. The poor conditions at Camp Van Doren had so appalled the 40-year-old chaplain that he tried to resign his commission. He understood better than anyone what Hendricks's life had been like since he was drafted into the segregated army. At Saint-Vouguet, the 2 men had prayed together on Thanksgiving. Now, on the gallows at Prumodon, they were still side by side. Saunders was not the only black man at Prumodon on November 24. 3 African-American enlisted men from service units other than Hendricks's had been ordered to attend the ceremony. It was lip service to the so-called separate but equal policy of Army segregation, which stipulated in the memorandum on hangings that there were to be black witnesses present along with the whites. After Hendrick's feet were bound, the ceremony proper began. The commandant asked him the requisite question. "Do you have a last statement to make before the order directing your execution is carried out?" "No, sir." Chaplain Saunders began to recite the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." The commandant interrupted the verse. It was time for Saunders to ask Hendricks his own official question, as dictated by the strict protocol of the hanging memorandum. "Do you have a statement to make to me as chaplain?" "Thank you for what you did for me," James Hendricks answered. "Tell all the boys not to do what I did." Amidst the carnage of World War II, the spectacle at Prumodal was a minor incident. Only a dozen men had been at James Hendricks's trial. The crowd that came to watch him hang was small. Once they were gone, who would remember what he did, what happened to him, or what it meant? Ordinary crimes such as his are not part of the story of D-Day or the legacy of the greatest generation. They seem destined to fade in memory, then disappear forever, except that one man could not forget. He was a Frenchman and writer named Louis Guillou. Guillou was not at the ceremony on that rainy November day, but he knew more about Hendricks's crime and punishment than anyone at Prumodal. He had attended James Hendricks's court-martial as an interpreter, translating the testimony of the French civilian witnesses into English for the Americans. He had witnessed many acts of war and occupation, cowardly acts and heroic ones. But these American military trials haunted him for decades. He remembered Hendricks's story in all its details. There were a few things people always liked to say about Louis Guillou. He had a perfect ear for language and a perfect sense of justice. His ear for language came through in the dialogue he wrote and in his ability to translate. He spoke English beautifully, though he had only been in England once as a boy. His sense of justice was just as sharp. It didn't have to do with ideology, but with a kind of lucidity about the world, about what mattered, what was fair and unfair. When Guillou sensed an injustice, he wouldn't let it rest. His friends still remember him cradling a pipe in his left hand, tilting his head, his eyes sparkling with discernment. He didn't care if you agreed with him or not. He liked to ask uncomfortable questions, and he wasn't satisfied until he understood the answers in all their complexity. After a month working for military justice in the U.S. Army, Louis Guillou began to sense that something was very wrong. The guilty were always black, he mused, so much so that even the stupidest of men would have ended up asking himself how it was possible that there be so much crime on one side and so much virtue on the other. Post-war Army statistics confirm Guillou's intuition. In an after-action report, the Judge Advocate General's Department revealed that 70 men were executed for capital crimes between 1943 and 1946. 55 of them were African Americans. That's 79% in an army that was only 8.5% black. Guillou thought about it for 20 years. Then he began to write. Now, I began to write as well. After a lot of research, I decided that Guillou's approach was the one I wanted to follow. By focusing on just 2 cases, rather than generalizing, he gave us a powerful example of the minute operations of Jim Crow, the Army's practice of segregating black and white troops and pretending their roles were separate but equal. Now, we Northerners usually think of segregation as a Southern phenomenon, but it was practiced throughout the United States and in the U.S. Army by official policy until 1948. Following Guillou, I wanted to contextualize the crimes and punishments of James Hendricks and George Whittington within the logic of Jim Crow. I also wanted to unfold each trial and study the components of each, the kind of defense each man received, the shape the prosecution took, and the life and the death that followed each verdict. My goal is what historians call a micro-history of segregation through the vehicle of these two trials. James Hendricks was trained as a menial laborer in an infamous boot camp in Mississippi, Camp Van Doren, where the conditions were so bad the African-American chaplain stationed with him tried to resign his commission. A race riot broke out when the local sheriff killed a black soldier outside the gates of the camp in the town of Centerville. No one who was at Camp Van Doren can ever forget the swamps, the mosquitoes, nor the racism of the locals. By contrast, Captain George Whittington's treatment in the military was almost opposite Hendricks's. He was a member of the super elite Rangers, the men depicted in Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan as the heroes of the D-Day landing. He trained in a top-secret camp in Scotland, and he was decorated for his bravery and aggression on June 6th. Hendricks was an assistant truck driver, helping bring the supplies for the liberation of Europe through France to Belgium and Germany. Whittington, after the D-Day assault, was sent to Brittany to liberate the port town of Brest from the Nazis. So the interpreter follows their cases step by step. Hendricks was apprehended by his commanding officer, Donald Tucker, one of the rare African Americans to reach officer status in the Army. Tucker, probably the most poignant figure in my story, was called upon to testify both for Hendricks's prosecution and his defense. Whittington was sent to a hospital for psychiatric examination rather than to the stockade where Hendricks awaited trial. Hendricks was prosecuted by a brilliant New York lawyer, Louis Guillau's boss, and defended by a junior combat officer with law school training but no criminal experience. Whittington was defended by the same lawyer who prosecuted Hendricks, working in tandem with his own brother David, a lawyer who happened to be stationed as an officer nearby and came to help with his defense. The Army lawyers saw little worth defending in the actions of the drunken black private who fired blindly through a door, killing a French peasant, then assaulting his widow. The white ranger officer, on the other hand, convinced the American court-martial that his own intentional shooting of a French resistance fighter in what was called Le Western Saloon of the Hôtel de France was legitimate self-defense, and that the mysterious Frenchman, who spoke with a strange accent, was most likely a Nazi spy. As readers, you might wonder why Guillou had such a strong sense of unfairness after participating in these two trials. Why not compare two trials that were more similar? The best answer to this question requires a detour through the twisted logic of American apartheid. Black and white soldiers in World War II were not in the same army. Their education, their training, their assignments, and their treatment by authorities were radically different. Black and white soldiers were separate, but never equal, even in crime. If Guillou chose to juxtapose the trial of a celebrated hero of Omaha Beach with that of a Southern black enlisted man with a 10th grade education, it was because, when put side by side, the two men's stories revealed so many presuppositions about race and privilege. And because their trials, despite the appearance of careful judicial procedure, and despite the well-meaning intentions of honorable men, were rife with prejudice. According to the letter of the law, Hendricks was indeed guilty of felony murder. According to the letter of the law, Whittington was not guilty by reason of self-defense. What Guillou, the outsider, saw was this: a black man killed another man by accident and was condemned to death. A white man killed deliberately and was acquitted by the strength of his own word. How could this happen in a just world? It took an outsider like Guillou to reveal cracks in the system of separate and equal, so natural to the men working within the system. They never questioned it. You have to be an American to understand, they told Guillou. Looking at these trials from the perspective of a foreign interpreter is like changing languages. It allows us to see our own history from a whole new point of view, where what is natural suddenly becomes strange. 1,000 small assumptions about criminality and justice form the pattern that leads to the larger statistic with which I began. 70 men were executed for capital crimes in the European theater of operations between 1943 and 1946. 55 of them were African American. Guillou didn't have this larger picture, but he knew with a writer's intuition that his experience was important. OK Joe, his novel, was his testimonial. Everything I had seen came back to me, he wrote in the final pages of his novel. I had been a witness, and I told myself that one day I, in turn, might again raise my right hand and say, I swear. Thank you. But if people want to go to the mic set up there, otherwise I'll just repeat your question into the mic here. Yes.
How do you account for the status of Louis Guillou in the history of French literature? Why is he so obscure compared to the ones you've named?
It's a very interesting question.
Céline,
I'm sorry.
Céline, for example.
Right. The question is, why is Guillou so relatively obscure in French literature compared to men who were his very best friends? I mean, his editor after the war was Camus, somebody we all know. He was very, very close to Malraux after the war. Malraux became Minister of Culture under de Gaulle, and Louis Guillou was still living by a shoestring up in Brittany. And he and the other friend of his, who was very, very famous in French literature, was André Gide, who took Guillou on a trip to the Soviet Union in the 1930s to see what was going on with the communist experiment. And Guillou was quite skeptical when he returned. It's really hard to know. I think that he was a very, very modest man. He was not a self-promoter. In fact, I think he was somewhat of an annoying guy. I spoke to Bernard Pivot, the talk show host in Paris, who had interviewed him for French television. He said it was the hardest interview he ever did. Guillou just didn't suffer fools and had a lot of positions that made people uncomfortable. I don't know if that can explain his place in the canon, but I'm hoping he's about to have a little revival. Well, you ask a story that's very hard to answer for one reason, and this is one of my pet peeves with the state of the archives, this material. In order to get a trial transcript from the U.S. Army, you have to know the proper name of the defendant. It's impossible to ask the Army, for example, to send you transcripts of everybody who was acquitted of murder or murder and rape in the summer of 1944. So it's something that I can't answer with a kind of scientific exactitude. I can tell you that, in general, men who were in service units tended to be condemned more often, were considered more dispensable, were available for trial in a way. Their commanding officers were available to testify against them. It was the commanding officer who would bring the charges. And often in the case of combat officers, they were sent back into the field. So I think you would find, if you look at those statistics, that you would have many more combat officers acquitted, and that perhaps even the white men who were condemned to death and executed were in service units of some kind. Well, the figure of 70 is, the question was, if I mentioned 70 men executed in the European theater, why are there 96 men buried in Plot E, the grave outside the World War I cemetery where the Army has buried dishonorable dead? And that's because Plot E also represents men who were in the Mediterranean theater of operations and the North African theater of operations. And there the racial disparity is even greater. I believe 80 of those 96 men are African Americans. And that's where I found Louis Till, Emmett Till's father, who was executed in Italy. No, I did not, and it's interesting you bring up that case. A private Slovak was buried in Platier with the other dishonorable dead, and he was brought home through a lot of lobbying by his family. And it sets a precedent, and the family that I've been working with in Warren County, North Carolina, are interested in bringing their family member back. So there's the Slovak example. No, I didn't find anything to refute that. As far as I know, he was the only American soldier executed for desertion, which is quite extraordinary when you think that the figure for Germany is something like 20,000 executed for desertion. That's quite a controversial case, the Slovak case. There's been a movie about it and a number of books. I'm glad the question is, why did Guillou write this story of his experience as an interpreter as a novel? And it's one of my favorite questions. Thank you for asking. I think because Guillou was part of that generation who really believed that the political novel was the very most powerful form. When you wanted to express a passion about an injustice, if you wanted to tell a history, you used the novel. Sartre did it, Camus did it. You think about great novels like The Plague. It was the way to express injustice. And there was a huge readership for political novels. I really think that the genre has suffered quite a lot. It's not, the political novel, you know, now we have many psychological novels and historical fiction, but nothing like these political works of the existentialist generation. The other reason was, he wasn't a researcher. I mean, when he wrote OK Joe, it was 20 years after the time when he had been an interpreter. He didn't have any documentation. He had a fabulous memory. He describes the bullet holes in the door of the Bignon farmhouse, and he describes people. I mean, when I saw the pictures of some of the people who appear in his novel, he just got them. He got Juan Cedillo, who was he described a kind of vain man who was always looking at his fingernails in the courtroom. He was the law member on the court-martial panel. And the question was OK Joe popular in France? I've never looked at the sales figures. It came out in 1976. It was very well reviewed. It came out 4 years before he died, and it's available in a very popular paperback edition, so people are still reading it today. Yes. The question is, did I speak to any of the white officers involved? Well, I had the good fortune to go visit a man in Florida who had done the pre-trial investigation for George Whittington's case. And he was just so generous with his time. I asked him hundreds of questions, including, you know, what would have been on George Whittington's uniform. I spoke to a man who's 96 years old who was on the court-martial panel. And he remembers the defense lawyer trying to decide whether he was going to let George Whittington testify or not. I wasn't able to speak to George Whittington. He's no longer alive. I really wish I had been able to speak to him. He had quite an extraordinary life after the war that I describe in my book. Yes? Mm-hmm. It's something I could talk about for a long time. Maybe I could talk to you about it afterwards as well. I hesitated quite a lot. I found Hendrick's family through the 1930 census. James Hendricks was on it as a 6-year-old boy. He was an adopted child in a very affluent farm family up in Macon, North Carolina. And I spoke to the funeral parlor people in Macon and Warrenton, North Carolina, who knew the community really well, the African American community, and they directed me to a woman in the family who organizes family reunions. They thought she would be the best person. I wrote her. Later she told me that she wouldn't have answered my letter except I used the word Jim Crow in it, so she figured I was okay. She called. And I made a couple trips up there to meet with her and her cousin who had grown up on the farm with James Hendricks. And they were, you know, sad, but very glad to learn what had happened. They had received, eventually we got all the papers from the Army, and we saw the communication with the family, a slightly older generation. The Army had written that James Hendricks had died due to his own willful misconduct. That was what they were told. And I was surprised to see, well, I shouldn't have been surprised, the same phrase in Mamie Till's autobiography. She describes getting a telegram saying that Louis Till had died of his own willful misconduct. If you're a farm family in the 1940s in Macon, North Carolina, that phrase is not transparent. They had always suspected that he had sassed off to a white officer and been shot. They thought he'd been shot by a firing squad, and that's the story I heard told in the town. But they actually were glad to learn what really happened. They did say if I had been dealing with the older generation that it would have been much, much more difficult. You know, enough time had passed. The question is, was the hanging consistent with the policy of the U.S. Army at the time? Yes, I believe it was. There was a standard operating procedure on hanging, and that was the death sentence, and that was the way that the death sentence was done in these capital cases. Now remember, it's 10 years after public execution has been abolished in the United States. So for a lot of the American soldiers who were witnesses, it was very upsetting to see a public hanging. For me, the issue is not what the U.S. Army should do now. It's really recognizing an experience of African American veterans that's very, very different from white veterans. And really, it's talking to my African American students at Duke in classes where World War II has come up. And I realized that our myth of the greatest generation does erase this shadow, and it should not be erased. Yes, the comment was that the war was a just war, but the social conditions were difficult. One man says he'll never forget being at the training camp and seeing German POWs marching off to a movie theater singing some Nazi song, and it was a movie theater that the black troops were not allowed to go to. And that always stayed with him. It stayed with him after all these years as indicative of the injustice. It occurred in the South in one of the training camps where there was also a large population of POWs. But I saw a lot of complaining in the archives, a lot of complaints that German POWs were, well, the French resistance complained that the German POWs were treated better than they were. And the African American troops also complained that the German POWs were treated better. Thank you. Well, thank you for these many questions, and we can continue informally.